Lecture 18 in Western Civ 1. Feudal Contributions to Western Civilization. As we begin today, I draw your attention to some passages that talk about lordship. In Acts chapter 2, verse 36, Peter, speaking to the people of Jerusalem, said that this Jesus who they crucified, God had made Lord and Savior. In the book of Romans, in chapter 10, verse 9, what we find is it's essential, if you're going to be saved, that you must confess that Jesus is Lord. In 1 Corinthians, Paul, writing in chapter 1, verse 9, in talking about Christians, talks about the fact that we have fellowship with God's Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. For us as Christians, we affirm what we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6, that there's one Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Jesus is Lord. What that means is that He's our boss. Now, we don't use the term Lord too often here in American society nowadays. Sometimes we might have quaint recollections of people who might be called lords in England. But we don't want to have lords. We want to be people who are free citizens, and we don't have people who are over us as lords. But in fact, we do have a lot of people who can tell us what to do. Our Lord has authority over us. He's the boss of us. He can tell us what to do. And we need to recognize that Jesus has the authority to tell us what to do. Otherwise, we're not Christians. We have to recognize that Jesus is our Lord. As we talk about feudal society, we're going to get some insights here on lordship, and perhaps it might stimulate some of your thinking about your submission to Jesus as your Lord. In thinking about feudal society, we want to begin by understanding this word. Feudalism is a word that comes out of Old French for a system of land tenure, where land is held either in fief or in fee, where people make arrangements to control land based upon either making promises or by paying a rental sort of arrangement. We come to associate this with a period of history in Western society where in Western Europe people came to possess land that they gained by means of subjecting themselves to various lords. Now, this system of land ownership, where you get land from a powerful warlord and you make certain promises to them, comes out of a sense of vulnerability. We've talked about this vulnerability that was brought on by the invasions of the Vikings, the Magyars, and the Saracens, the Muslims coming from the south. These things helped to promote a sense of anarchy and confusion and struggle to survive. And so, when there's economic vulnerability like that, people are looking for protection. And Germanic culture had an answer, namely that you could depend upon a local warlord. And warriors had been changing with the coming of knights, particularly armored warriors who were practiced, skilled in their weaponry, who could particularly fight from horseback, where they had a weapons launching platform that was highly mobile, and they had the advantage of height, and they could use the leverage from that superior platform where they sat on a saddle with stirrups. It was a stable launching platform, and they could intimidate their opponents. They were somewhat immune to the attacks of people who might come along with sharpened sticks and pitchforks and the like, and that they had this armor. So, feudalism is going to be something of a clever response to the sense of vulnerability, where people are going to look to their lord for protection. And so feudalism has a political aspect here, where people have relationships with each other, and the way that one comes into this relationship is that one does homage. In doing homage, a vassal, that'll be the subject individual, will come to his suzerain or his lord humbly, beseeching, making a request, a prayer, protect me. And this is seen in the act of homage, where typically a person will be kneeling before the superior, before the Lord, making the request, let me be the Lord's man, let me be your man, Let me be your woman. Let me serve you. And there'd be promises that would be made. Again, this feeds right into Germanic society where personal loyalties and personal relationships are very, very strong, and a person's word is taken to be very valuable. They're pledging, they're promising that they will obey, that they will serve. In this arrangement, now, it's not just a one-way street. There would be reciprocal rights and duties. So, first of all, the vassal, that will be the person who comes requesting protection here, they're going to pledge loyalty. They're going to pledge hospitality and support. By these things, what we mean is that they will give military service. They will protect their lord as they're able to do so. If their lord gets in trouble, they'll come to his assistance. If he's taken hostage, they would ransom him. If he is in need of sustenance, they would feed him, they would house him along the way. So these are responsibilities of the vassals. Now, we'll find there's a variety of vassals. Some vassals are very powerful, but they're always going to be subject to even more powerful lords. So, as we think about lords, what's their responsibility? Where their responsibility is to protect the vassal and to provide the vassal with a benefice, or what might also be called a fief. That would be resources that they could use. So the Lord's promising protection. I will protect you, and I will give you land that you can occupy, and in response you're going to provide service or rental fees for the use of that land. So this is a system whereby people can look to somebody to protect them, somebody who is a great warrior, somebody who has armor, weapons, skills in battle that they come to and they can trust will protect them in their time of need. And so it's a reciprocal arrangement as it begins. Now, what you need to understand is that this moves throughout society, and they develop something that is sometimes described as sub-infeudation. So in a feudal pyramid, you begin at the top, we'll say, with a king. And the king has an upper nobility. These are great warriors, and we saw some of this within Charlemagne's territory, where he had counts who ruled over start out with dukes that would rule over a military district. They would be particularly great warriors. And then you have counts who rule over counties, and in each county there's particularly a central urban center. And so a count usually has one urban center that they're responsible for. But there will be other titles that would be given to different types of territories that might have various kinds of responsibilities. So, for example, a march would be a frontier territory where there's a lot of battles that go on. And so we'll find there'll be a variety of different titles that emerge in feudal society amongst different people groups. So we're going to have other titles like margraves, marquets, barons, and the like. So these would be the upper nobility. They are given larger tracts of land, and they come to the king just like a peasant would come to a local knight, and they pledge their fealty. They do homage. They kneel before the king. They lift their hands up in prayer, and he reaches down and encloses their hands within his hands and promises protection and gives them the right to access to land. Now those upper nobility in turn have power over lower nobles who come to them and swear, hey, I need your protection and aid, and I will serve you, and in return that lord, who's maybe now a count, will promise to a local knight here in the lower nobility, I will give you land, and in return you will give me service. Particularly as a knight, you're going to give me military service. You're going to come fight for 40 days of the year, and you're going to get land as a result that you can occupy, and there will be people who live on that land that are owing their allegiance to you as their lord. So you can at the same time be a lord and a vassal. Now, down with the lower nobility, they're going to have people who live on the land and work the land, who work for them. So the upper part of the feudal pyramid are people who fight. The lower part are going to be the people who work the land. Now there's amongst these people who work the land, we sometimes might call them peasants, but there is a gradation amongst peasants who serve the local knights. Some people are known as husbands, some as cotters, some as serfs. Each one of these titles describes a person who has a slightly different relationship. So we still today talk about husbanding the land. These are people who care for the land. They have an interest in the land because they have a greater investment in it, a greater ownership in it. A cotter is a person who owns their own cottage. A serf doesn't own any land of their own and doesn't have as much private property, and so they're going to depend more upon their lord for resources, tools and the like. And so how is it that they're going to serve? Well, they'll serve by working the land that they will work to make productive so that their lord can have resources, and he'll be able to feed his war horse. He'll be able to acquire expensive armor, and this is the system of subinfeudation. Now, there's a second group of people, a third group of people. We have the king, we have the upper nobility, and the peasants, but we also have another group of people, and that's the clergy. Where do they fit in? Well, the upper clergy are much like the upper nobility, and so you'll have archbishops who rule over many bishops, and they have a large territory over which they're responsible for spiritual matters. Then you'll have bishops who are particularly spiritual leaders who are over an urban center where there's a bishopric or a cathedral where they have their chair. And then there'll be local parish priests who are sort of on the equivalent as being beneath the upper clergy and the lower clergy, if you will. And you might have abbots of monasteries. So there's a very strict, ordered society where people have roles, where they have obligations. They know the chain of command. And people are going to find, though, that there is sometimes confusion where an individual may be simultaneously a vassal of his lord or her lord, and at the same time a lord over their own vassals. So, to whom do you owe your allegiance? Allegiance is a critical issue here for them, particularly as a person might swear their fealty to multiple lords. If I get land from one lord because I'm a great knight, and then I swear my loyalty to another lord, and he gives me more land and people that work on that land, I have obligations to two different lords, so I have a divided allegiance. And so what they needs to be discerned here is that you have to figure out who is your liege lord. Sometimes in an old movie you might hear somebody say, my liege. Your liege lord is the one that you owe first allegiance to. So you might have multiple obligations, but you obey your liege lord first. It's important to have this sorted out, because if you have multiple obligations, and we'll say that your two lords go to war against each other and you're a knight, well, which side are you going to go fight for? Well, you're supposed to go fight for your liege lord, the one that you owe your first obligation to. Now, this system works well as long as you have great warriors who get territories as something of a reward for their success, and you have war leaders who have many warriors who fight for them, and they are willing to pledge their loyalty to a greater warrior, a king. And so we find that, first of all, amongst the nobility, their primary task in society was to fight. Later on, as we would come to talk about the French Revolution, they sometimes talk about the three estates of feudal society, or what they would call the ancient regime in France. You have those who fought, those who work and those who pray. The first estate is actually seen as those who pray. The clergy are seen to be playing a critical role. Life in a fallen world is a tough thing, but just imagine how bad it would be if we didn't have these people praying for us and interceding with God on our behalf, whether it's the local secular clergy or the regular clergy in monasteries who would be praying for us as we give them gifts and encourage them to pray for us. Things would be terrible if they weren't interceding for us. So they're the first estate. The second estate are those who fight, and the third estate are those who work. So this is the way that feudal society develops. There's mutual obligations and responsibilities, and yet sometimes there's some confusions that come. So what happens when a duke who has sons raises his sons? He's going to train them to be warriors. They're going to have the advantage of having access to certain kinds of weapons that they can learn how to employ, access to horses, and they're going to be trained as knights. But just because a father's a great warrior, does that mean that his son's going to be a great warrior? And should sons all inherit a portion of their father's estate? This will be an issue that they face. If you take a duke's territory and divide it amongst his three oldest sons, as was Germanic tradition, then you're going to weaken that family and make them more vulnerable. You don't have a great duke who can raise a large war force on your behalf as king. And these sons, how did they get their position? Do they get their position just because they happen to be born to this family, or because they are qualified as great warriors who inspire and lead many men into battle successfully? So something that we'll see develops in Europe is the observation of primogeniture. So oldest surviving sons typically inherit the title of their father and all of the land. Younger brothers get lesser titles. Now, nobles are going to want to have multiple sons because as you raise them up to be warriors, they have to train in fighting, and sometimes they get nicked and cut and damaged along the way, and in an age before antibiotics, oftentimes people can die from wounds inflicted in practices. So having multiple sons is good because that way you can ensure your family line will continue, and if somebody dies as a child because of childhood diseases, then you have spare sons. But what do you do with spare sons? If you have multiple sons, as they come to maturity, we're going to find is that oftentimes the nobles are going to look to find positions of power where their sons can be knights and can exercise the things that they've learned, but they don't want to give up family land, and so they'll oftentimes look for them to take up positions in the church. And we'll find this causes some issues as they're trained in fighting, and it's not necessarily spiritual warfare that they're particularly adroit at conducting. We'll come back to this later. So we've looked at the political arrangement here between people, the social arrangement, but let's look at the economic arrangement. The general face of feudalism is down on the manor, down on the farm. This might be seen as something the equivalent of a plantation in American history. At the manor, one has as participants the lord of the manor and vassals. The lord of the manor would typically be somebody like a knight. He has a horse, weapons, armor, military know-how, and he's gained this manor, this territory, because he's pledged his loyalty to his superior. But as the lord of the manor, he receives vassals, those who serve him, who come to him in homage and raise their hands and pledge, "We'll be your man, we'll be your woman, we will serve you faithfully." And he in return promises, as he receives them in his hands, "I will protect you, and I will allow you to have access to land." Now on the land, the vassals working the land of a manor had obligations to work the land. Certainly there's some mutual obligations to security, but as they work the land, if you come into this relationship not having any tools, not having much at all, how are you going to pay back the lord of the manor for access to the land? Well, you don't have anything to put up front, but you make a promise. And so typically what happened is that people would work half their work week on the Lord's land. This is known as the Demosine land. And so 3 days a week, half of their work week, they would work on the Demosine land, and half the week they would work on their own land. So do you get up as early to work on days when you're going to work on the Demosine land as you do on your own land? This is going to be an issue as people are interested in serving themselves in a fallen world. And so what we'll find is that oftentimes manors would develop local officials that would be managers who served beneath the lord of the manor. And so you might have a manor reeve who would make sure that you were getting up to do your work as a vassal working on the land, that you would work on the Lord's land. And so there would be markers in fields to delineate which land was yours as a vassal and which land belonged to the lord of the manor. Now, there are going to be many restrictions. Okay, so there's freedoms that come. You get to work certain land, but as you come as a vassal here and you don't bring much to the table here, you need equipment. And so in order to be able to get access to equipment that the lord of the manor has, again, you're going to be working on Demosine land. Typically, you're going to work the first day of the week on the Lord's land, and then you'll get time to work on your land, and then you'll come back and kind of comes back and forth. But you want to have equipment. So, for example, in Europe, they're going to develop and increasingly use the heavy plow, the karuka. And this will be able to cut through the heavier clay soils of northern Europe. But once you do successfully grow crops like grains, well, then you want to grind them, so you need access to the mill. And once you get your grains milled and you have flour, well, then you need access to an oven. And perhaps if you have grapes, you need access to the press. If you have olives, you need access to the olive press. And so these would be pieces of equipment that not everybody owned, that are shared, but they're controlled by the lord of the manor. You're also going to need various resources. When you want wood to make a tool or to build a house, the wood that's on the manor is not yours as a vassal. You have to get permission to get access to wood. If you want structural timbers, you're going to have to get permission to cut down timbers, cut down trees. As far as to fuel your fire, you can burn dried dung, or you can pick up twigs and limbs that fall out of the trees, but you can't cut the trees down. When it comes to resources that are natural resources otherwise, for example, game, if you have rabbits and deer that are there, well, they represent a certain amount of protein that can be acquired. But these are not things that just anybody can go hunting at any time they decide that, hey, they're hungry and they want some meat. Or if we have a stream that flows through this manor or nearby, perhaps the lord of the manor might arrange that some of the time people would spend time building a dam where they could create a pond and fish could be raised. Well, can you go fishing anytime you want? No, this is something that's controlled by the lord of the manor, and what'll happen is maybe once a year they'll drain the lake and net the fish and preserve them for the use on the manor. As you live on the manor, you're dependent upon the lord of the manor for access to equipment, for various resources, and you're subject to the manor court. The lord of the manor is the judge of incidents that happen there. If you have a wicked lord, then you have troubles. You won't get justice. Now, the majority of people here in the early Middle Ages are going to be occupied with farming. Crop yields are diminishing here as we have some climatic fluctuations, and they're trying to figure out how they can be more productive. Coming out of the Roman world and memories of that, they practiced something of an open field system. They didn't have a whole lot of fences around fields, and they shared these fields. And there were some benefits. Particularly here, as you work the demesne land, what would happen is that you'd have multiple fields on the manor, but those fields would be divided up into strips. This is partially because of the nature of plowing in those days. Basically, fields were long strips. The draft animals, oxen, would pull a plow until they got tired. Then you would stop, let the animal rest, turn the plow around, and plow back in the other direction. So this is what leads to these fields being long, narrow strips. And so what happens is the peasants who lived on the manor, the vassals, would get some of these strips, and they would share some of these strips in fields where the lord of the manor had strips which were his, and he will collect the resources that are grown on those fields. This has a benefit in that everybody living on the manor has mutual concern about that field. If a fire starts, it's not just, hey, oh, that's the lord of the manor's field, I don't care about it. That crop of grain that's been grown so carefully, as it dries out, hey, if there's a fire, you want to go make sure that gets stomped out very quickly, because it'll spread from his field, his crops, onto yours. So there's a mutual concern for that field in this open field system. But the open field system, while it's going to generate mutual concern, and it will also help to reduce the impact of localized disasters like that fire I was talking about. So what will happen is they'll have multiple fields with multiple strips in these fields, and a peasant may have some strips in one field and some strips in another field. So if we'll say a field that's close to the river, which enjoys the benefits of greater moisture but also has the perils of being flooded out and drowned by the waters. If you have both strips of land that are in a field that's at a higher elevation and then strips of land in the field by the river, then everybody's sharing the same sort of peril, and you avoid the impact of localized disasters. All of your eggs aren't in one basket, in a sense. There would still, however, be problems here, disputes over ownership, as people might move piles of rocks, cairns that might mark the boundaries of these strips, and as they're sometimes going to be vulnerable to predation of hungry animals. And so there's not walls to particularly protect these fields, but you might have somebody who serves as a lookout. You might remember the little nursery rhyme of Little Boy Blue, come blow your horn. You might have people who are working to scare away birds that would come peck up the seeds that have been planted, or protect the fields from predations of animals that might otherwise graze away the food that you're going to depend upon come winter. In medieval fields, they started out using the light plow that came from the Romans, but something that develops here and expands dramatically in the time period of the early Middle Ages is the heavy plow. It has a plowshare which cuts through the clay soils and turns the soils over. So you're pulling up soils from down below and aerating the soils, breaking up the sod so the roots of the plants that you sow will be able to make their way into the soil where they find moisture and nutrients. So the plow is going to be an important development that comes out of the early Middle Ages. But in order to gain greater produce, part of the creativity of this time period, again, some people characterize this as a time of dark ages where nothing new happens and there's no inventions and it's terribly backwards. Well, clearly this is not the case. As we move through the Middle Ages, what we find is they move to something that they'd known before, that we see in the Old Testament, where they oftentimes might have two fields, where you might have land that's in production and land that's left fallow. That is, it's left alone to regenerate its natural nutritional status, and you're not just forever pulling nutrients out of the soil. What you find in the Bible is that every 7th year they let the land lay fallow. Well, in early Middle Ages, what happens in Europe is that they'd have half of their land which would be fallow, and the other half of their land which they would keep in production. So they basically had two sectors of their land. Now, the land that lay fallow, they could still use for pasturage. Animals could come and graze on it, and if there was volunteer crops that grew there, they could eat those things, and as they ate the grass, as they ate other vegetation, they'd leave behind manure which would fertilize the fields. So the two-field system did allow them to continue living in one place without draining the nutrients out of the soil that they diminished their crop yields. So that was effective in that regard. But an important development that comes along is the three-field system. Under the two-field system, 50% of your land was out of production at any one time. Under the three-field system, now only one-third of the land will be out of production. So there's 66% of your land that's in production. And this is going to improve productivity, and that's going to have an impact in what's possible, namely people living off the land and engaging in craft specialization. And so what's going to happen is that there's going to be increased yields as they have more land in production. Under this system, there will in fact be some less plowing, greater crop yields, rejuvenated soils, and a better distribution of the work. And so this is an important invention that happens. Now, in this time period of the Middle Ages, crop yields we would consider to be terrible by today's standards. Today here in America, if we plant a single seed of corn, we expect to get 2 cobs off that plant that grows. And on each one of those cobs, there may well be over 300 seeds. And so that would be a 600-to-1 return on that seed that's planted. That's a magnificent ratio. Now, they don't have corn in Europe at this point in time. We'll have to wait until Western Civ 2 to see if that's a crop that comes from the New World. And so they don't have corn crops. But they're going to depend upon grain crops and various legumes. They're going to grow wheat and barley and oats as grain crops that they can keep dry and can grind as they need bread. That's going to be where they get the majority of their calories, is through grain crops, either made into bread or fermented to make beers that they would drink. The other crops they produce will be particularly things like legumes, beans, and some of us might like little green peas, but they wouldn't grow little peas. You could eat those fresh, that would be fine, but their goal would be to grow large peas, and then you let them dry. And so peas would be sort of like the dry beans that you might have had sometime that have been rehydrated. But if you keep them dry, you can keep them all year long. And so as a result then, if you rehydrate these things, you can cook them up and make soups, make pottage, where you're going to get some proteins in what is otherwise a rather carbohydrate-focused diet. And so these crops are going to be important crops that they can preserve and eat when there are no fresh crops coming out of the fields. The results of this improved farming is going to be improved food supply. And as people have greater food supply, this will reduce mortality rate. They won't be as vulnerable to disease. Their children will be healthier and be able to resist childhood diseases. And so population is going to grow. As you are able to grow more food off the land, you can support more specialists who aren't working on the land. Previous to this, we've had the specialists, namely the Lord of the Manor, who's a fighter, who's being supported by food that other people grow for him, or the people in the clergy who are praying for you. And here on the manor, you might have some other people who are specialized in some manner. You might have a metal worker, a blacksmith, someone who works iron, who, in order to learn that skill, you need all these metal pieces of equipment on the manor. The Lord of the Manor wants somebody to help him with his armor, and so you might have this person as a specialist who is fed because he knows this particular trade. So improved farming is going to ultimately make possible the growth of urban areas where people would live because they're sure, hey, we have enough food and we can develop our specialization here because there's demand for the products that we produce. We'll talk later about the growth of urban societies in the later Middle Ages. The result of the spread of feudalism in Europe is going to be, first of all, the stabilization of society. They get to thinking that things are fairly stable. Now, there still be wars amongst people, but there's general stabilization, a sense of calm, particularly as people would have powerful warlords protecting them. What we've also seen, though, is there's a enmeshing of the church in the social structure. And so the church is going to become the lord of some people who serve as vassals on the church's land. Bishops who control sometimes cities will have knights fighting for them who may not always be terribly godly people, but they may be great warriors. And so the church is going to get tied into this social structure, and it's not always going to have a clear voice in calling out lords who were unjust. So we have this social stratification we talked about of the third estate, those who worked, and their lives would be characterized by working 6 days a week, and you have the 1 day off on Sunday. This would be their day of rest. Now, there would be some seasonal variation in work patterns. Some seasons you're going to work harder than others. But when the sun's up, you get to work. When the sun goes down, well, it's time to quit. They didn't have a whole lot of artificial light sources. They'll have wax that they can use to make candles. They'll have various vegetable oils they can use to fuel lamps that have wicks in them. But as we think about social stratification, what we recognize is that for each of these social strata, there are different characteristics to their life. Peasant life on the manor would be characterized by seasonal work patterns. Their housing might vary amongst some of them, but typically they're rather small structures made of wood with thatching on the roof. The walls might be stone sometimes, but oftentimes the wooden walls, the vertical posts, would be filled in between them by wattle and daub construction. That is, that you weave smaller branches back and forth, and then you jam mud, clay that's maybe manure-rich and has a lot of animal hair in it, if you have that available, into the wattle and into the weaving of the wood, and those would create walls for you and keep the draft out. So you're looking for shelter from the cold particularly, and from the sun, and from the wet. And so a thatched roof made out of reeds or grasses would cause the water to run off of you and keep you dry, and if it's cold outside, you're not suffering hypothermia, and it would protect you from the sun at other times of the year. But families lived in fairly small structures. There wasn't a whole lot of privacy here. Oftentimes these are one-room affairs. They don't typically have chimneys, and so it would be a very smoke-rich environment, kind of dark inside. They don't have a whole lot of windows, and so a dark, smoky interior where there's not a whole lot of privacy would be rather characteristic. When it comes to their food, I've already suggested most of the food that's going to be eaten is going to be carbohydrates in the form of flour that's turned into either bread or beers. There will be dried vegetables otherwise, and typically people might end up eating protein in the form of meat once a week, or certainly on holy days, on holidays, where they might kill an animal, or there might be hunting and there might be meat that's shared amongst the people in the manor. There's not a whole lot of meat. They're not eating meat every day, and so legumes are going to be important sources for protein. Other calorie-rich foods are going to be particularly treasured. They don't have current American aversion to fat. Fat, according to them, would be good. You get a lot of calories that way. So they're concerned about getting enough calories. And people in the third estate, we're going to find, are something on the margin. There's going to be what we consider to be a horrible infant mortality rate. People don't live to be 65 years old very often. So we think that they die rather young. Now, as we move to the second estate, again, those who fought, it will vary between whether you're in the upper ranks of the nobility or the lower ranks of the nobility, but their work was to fight. Typically, their housing, they would have more square footage per person. Their houses were typically made out of stone. Down on the manor, you might have a manor house, where you have this village where the peasants live. The manor house would stand apart, and it will stand apart partially because of its construction. It'll be a larger area affair, and the family of the lord of the manor would live in such a place. These structures are oftentimes rather cool and drafty, and they may well have fireplaces where you can build a fire that's fed by larger dimension timbers. But fireplaces are generally good at roasting one side of you and leaving the other side neglected. So you've got to be like food on a spit. You've got to rotate a little bit if you want to keep uniformly warm in such fire-warmed locations. They had a greater variety of food, a greater supply of food available to them, and as a result they oftentimes would live a little bit longer, but even by our standards today there's often a terrible mortality rate. And the third estate would be the clergy, and in the clergy there would be a division between the upper clergy and the lower clergy. The basic work is to engage in spiritual warfare, and the housing of the clergy would depend upon their status. The upper clergy, bishops, were basically princes of the church, and they had all kinds of resources and good food and might tend to be more corpulent. That would be fat. Whereas the lower clergy, the local parish priest, maybe working on the manor, his life was not terribly different from the peasants who worked around him and with whom much of his time was focused. These political and social arrangements are going to be critically important in the development of Western Europe, in the eventual development of cities, but also in the development of feudal national monarchies. As we begin here, we have rather local kings who are at work, and we'll find that there's going to be some real challenges that come. Feudal society addressed the challenges of instability. But as time went on, there'd be various challenges to this new system. We've seen already inherent within it, it's dependent upon personal relationships, and when there get to be multiple lords, that can be very complicated. When you move beyond the first generation, where you have great warriors who get territory based upon their abilities at going to war, then you're challenged by claims of blood, where people get positions because they inherit those positions. As the instability calms down, then there comes to be questions: should there still be feudal societies? As towns grow, people are going to find there that they have greater independence, and this is going to challenge something of the political system of feudalism. One of the greater challenges is going to come, however, as kings find that they want to centralize power, and we'll see the growth of feudal national monarchies here in our subsequent discussions, where kings want to have armies that can fight for them, not just 40 days, as has been contracted, but 24/7 and every day of the year, because they're limited when they have armies that only fight for a certain short commitment. And kings are going to be able to do this when they're able to raise taxes. Rather than giving out land, they'd rather have a collection of taxes. We're going to find that this will be a challenge even down on the manor, where people are going to find that it's hard to make people work the demesne land, and it's nice when they can move into a society where they can basically pay rents instead of having labor exchanged. It's a whole lot simpler that way, and it's going to build the power of kings in particular, and eventually the system will continue on even after the great threats have disappeared, and the great warriors are no longer quite such a strategic asset as they had been at the beginning, when you had these knights who knew how to fight with their expensive horses and fabulously expensive weaponry and armor that protected them, as they were covered from head to toe by armor, beginning with chain mail and then moving eventually towards plate armor. This was fabulously expensive stuff. The knight was like the tank in the 20th century's battlefield, a mobile weapon that was somewhat invincible by the average person, and so this was a strategic asset here in this time period. Now, as we move to think about the church in this period, and think about religion here in the Middle Ages, medieval times, the church was the most powerful and pervasive institution in Western Europe. Religion is going to permeate nearly every aspect of life, and religious rituals were normal rites of passage. And as the sole interpreter of divine revelation and the conduit of the sacred rites, the clergy of the church would grow to be rather powerful. What we're going to find later is they're going to come into conflict with powerful kings sometimes, and sometimes force them to bow to the church's agenda, as they could excommunicate people and withhold sacraments which were thought to be needed for salvation. The church is seen as an ark in which one could survive the storms of uncertainty here in a fallen world. But we're going to find the medieval church has a lot of challenges that exist. Some of these challenges would continue to be doctrinal challenges. There would be a temptation of people to blend in and co-opt certain pagan symbols and ideas, and particularly they developed this idea that divine favor would be acquired rather mechanically. There's also the temptation to embrace things Roman, where you develop more of a legal relationship with God rather than salvation by faith. People look more and more towards their works, and this is going to lead people away from the beauty of salvation by grace through faith and not by works. So as we look at the medieval church, a key medieval doctrinal development is the move towards sacramentalism. This is the belief that through certain sacraments that the church is able to pass on blessings to individuals. As a person began their life, they believed in baptizing babies. Increasingly, as we come to the Middle Ages, they would also baptize new converts to Christianity who would be adults. But as Christians had babies, they were thought to inherit guilt from Adam, and thus, if not brought into the church and baptized, they would spend eternity in hell. And so they thought that through baptizing babies, they would plant the seed of faith in them, and since immersing babies was a challenge to their well-being, they certainly moved to changing the mode. So they've changed the subjects from being believers to parents who believed, and infants who didn't know what was going on other than they were getting wet. And the mode is changed towards sprinkling here in the Latin West. So this is these first of the sacraments. A baby was thought to become a Christian by being baptized here. The second rite would be confirmation. This will change as time moves on, but what we find is they move to a post-baptismal teaching period. They teach a catechism, and as they would anoint them here, there's something of an affirmation of the Holy Spirit that would help to sustain them spiritually. In the Middle Ages, what we find is they move this confirmation to the period of adolescence. As the modern Catholic Church has continued, typically this is around the age 7 today, where people would be anointed with oil after completing certain training. The next, it would be the Mass. What happens in the church at this time period is that people are dismassed. If you're not a Christian, then you don't stay for the communion service, this Eucharist, this celebration of thanksgiving. But something that changes during this time period is seen in the time period of Louis the Pious in 831, where we find the doctrine of transubstantiation is promoted. A teacher by the name of Radbertus presented a treatise on the body and blood of our Lord to Charles the Bald in the year 844. And in this he's going to assert that when the priest prays over the wine and the bread, it becomes the actual body and blood of Jesus. This is not something that's accepted all over Europe at this point in time, but this is going to be something that will come to be accepted and will become dogma in the Latin-speaking church. This will be something that is challenged in various places. A fellow by the name of Berengar of Tours would be condemned because in the year 1050 he would oppose the idea of transubstantiation. Later on in the Middle Ages there will be groups of people like the followers of Peter Waldo who will oppose this, but it's on a trajectory towards being widely accepted, and it will become dogma in the church in the year 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. Another sacrament was the sacraments of penance, where somebody comes and confesses their sins into the ear of the priest, and what we'll find is this will come to be expected as an annual event, minimally, by the Fourth Lateran Council in the year 1215. But under this process, a person who is feeling guilty comes and expresses their contrition, they make confession, and then they're given a absolution, they're forgiven, and they're supposed to make satisfaction. So they do something, they do penance in response to their sin. And so maybe they say certain prayers, they maybe make restitution to wounded parties, but there are various activities that the priests would tell people that they had to do in order to gain satisfaction for their sins. Another sacrament would be that of unction, particularly unction of the sick and dying. Peter Lombard will list this as a sacrament. In James chapter 5, verse 14, we found that people who were ailing would call on the church elders in the apostolic church, and they would pray over them. But this is a new idea that emerges here in the Latin-speaking church. As we mentioned in our reference to the Carolinians, what we find is that matrimony becomes a sacrament of the church. They understand that the purpose of matrimony is procreation, and the church gains jurisdiction over marriages. Prior to this, it's been largely a family, economic matter between families. But eventually, by the time we get to the 11th century, the church is holding jurisdiction over marriages as a divine institution. And we'll find that later on the scholastic Thomas Aquinas will affirm this as a means of conveying grace based upon Ephesians chapter 5 verse 32. This move towards making marriage something that's sacred will certainly make divorce a big issue, and the dissolution or annulment of marriages a hot issue. The final of the sacraments would be that of taking holy orders, to take vows of poverty and devotion in God's service and thereby become a clergy member. So these are the so-called 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church, which find their origins here in the Middle Ages. But the idea is that the Church controls these rites at various points in your life, from the time you're born to the time that you die, and through these things you gain spiritual benefit. And if you're at odds with the church, you can be cut off from these benefits. Now, as we think about the medieval church, what we find is there's this ongoing veneration of saints. I'm of the opinion this originates as something of a substitute for the pantheon of paganism, but in medieval Roman Catholicism, what we find is there's certain individuals who come to be identified as patron saints of certain types of activities. We'll have to wait to the later Middle Ages and Thomas Aquinas to see the idea that they've done more than enough good works which can then be applied to the sinner who makes supplication. The idea that praying through the saints would gain you access to the ear of God through these favored individuals. In the veneration of saints, though, there would be a preoccupation with the relics of saints. and we'll find that in the Western Church they will have relics that they venerate, but they don't have access to that many of these sorts of things until after the Crusades. So after the Crusades, this will become very, very much more important. But in the later Middle Ages, what we'll find is that reliquaries will be required to consecrate an altar. Many times churches will be dedicated in the names of various saints, and amongst those individuals who are venerated, we find that there's a growing veneration of Mary. Now, as we look in John chapter 19, verse 25, Jesus, in his relationship with Mary, certainly he cares for Mary, but within the early church there's no special veneration. He's going to commit her to John's attention there at the cross, but what we find is that in the early centuries of the church there had been quite a bit of speculation about Mary and her situation. You might find some of this in the Proto-Evangelium of James. Within the Eastern Church, there had been a debate whether she was the God-bearer, the Theotokos, or the Christ-bearer, and a dispute between Nestorian Christians and Orthodox Christians over what term they should use for Mary. Gregory of Tours, living around the year 590, began to teach the Assumption of Mary. This is the idea that Mary never died. And what we'll find is that by the year 1950, that becomes dogma in the Catholic Church. So there's going to be increasing veneration of Mary, and by the time we get to the 11th century and people like Bernard of Clairvaux and a little bit later with Thomas Aquinas, there's a widespread idea of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, that she was born of a virgin, born of Anne as a result of a miraculous conception. This will be opposed by people like Bernard of Clairvaux and Thomas Aquinas, but people like Radbertus, who I'd mentioned before, advocate this idea, and there'll be others like Duns Scotus and others that will advocate this, and this will become Roman Catholic dogma at the First Vatican Council in 1854. So there is going to be increased veneration of Mary, and there'll be songs to Mary that come about. The Salve Regina, an antiphonal plain song, emerged in the 11th century, where they would sing, "Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee do we cry, poor banished children of Eve, and to thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. Turn then, most gracious Advocate, your merciful eyes upon us, and after this our exile, show us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus, O merciful, O loving, O sweet Virgin Queen." So this is a song to Mary, asking her to intercede on the part of individuals. In the 11th century, we'll also find the words of Elizabeth emerging in a chant that is going to later on be fleshed out to become the Ave Maria, or Hail Mary. So you have the words, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus." And so Mary is going to be the subject of veneration, the thought being that Jesus would pay particular attention to his earthly mother. The medieval church is increasingly legalistic in their relationship with God, and this turns attention away from Christ. The veneration of relics, again, is going to be something that's going to expand dramatically after the Crusades, but once again, people moving away from just depending totally upon Christ and his righteousness, and are looking towards using intermediaries to help them. And they develop this idea that perhaps they can do more than enough good works, perhaps through their donations to the poor or donations to the church, that they're going to gain spiritual benefit from God, blessings that will help them hereafter. Perhaps it'll cover up for some of their shortfallings otherwise. What we'll find is there's increasing legalism, demands that people might fast at certain times and do various physical things in order to gain spiritual benefit. And this is going to be something that certainly turns attention away from Jesus. Now, amongst the people in the Middle Ages, as you have individuals being inducted into the clergy from different sources, you have sometimes people who are the spare sons of the nobility who come into the clergy, and you have spare sons and daughters that might be packed off into monasteries once they're not needed any longer. And what we find is in some of the monasteries they come to be wealthy. People think that these spiritual champions are benefiting them, and so they give great wealth to the monasteries, which means that then the monks don't have to work, the nuns don't have to work. In response to problems that emerged, there would be some reform movements amongst the clergy, particularly in the Cluniac movement. William of Aquitaine would give a large amount of land to help this new order to be free of feudal obligations. The Cluniac movement was going to continue to live under the Benedictine rule, so there's still these Western style of monks, but in the year 1095 they would dedicate their very large abbey at Cluny, and there will be eventually by 1100 more than 1,000 monasteries across Europe, which would be daughter houses which are subject to Cluny. So what they're looking to do is to help the monasteries to be free from political power, but the order comes to be quite powerful, and what we'll find is this order will advance certain clergy that assert clerical power later on, and because they're seen as great champions, they get to be the recipients of lots of gifts from people wanting to earn the favor of God, and the result is they develop very ornate worship structures and an elaborate liturgy. And so by the year 1098 there's another reform movement, and this would be the Cistercian reform movement. The characteristic of this reform movement is that they should withdraw from the world, to live a life of contemplation and austerity where they worked hard, and they maintained a lot of silence. And the Cistercian monasteries would have stark, undecorated chapels and structures, and they wouldn't accept anything but frontier land. And eventually, as they work hard on that land, they will become very, very powerful, and they'll contribute to Europe a number of important scholars like Bernard of Clairvaux. And so there are some attempts to reform the church, particularly in the monasteries, but in the local setting where you have local bishops, what we find is that oftentimes the spare sons of the nobility come to be members of the upper clergy, and this is going to lead them to problems. They've trained in physical warfare, but they don't know too much about spiritual warfare, and the result will be disastrous for the church, as we oftentimes would have immoral clergy and bishops that aren't feeding and caring for the flock. Instead, they're more interested in expanding their political territory and looking after their military obligations for their territories to the kings who might have assigned them to this position of being a bishop. The Middle Ages is an interesting time of creativity in response to challenges. It wasn't all dark. A lot of developments are happening which are contributing towards later society, and certainly some things are developing which are going to shape the political structures of later Europe. Thank you for your attention.